Flipping the Table.
I wanted to take a second to thank our sponsors, Whole Foods Market, the Public Health Institute, and Roots of Change. Without their help, we couldn't present this podcast. Hello, this is Michael Reed Dimmock, and you're listening to Flipping the Table, a podcast featuring honest conversations and brief commentaries about the future of food and farming. I'm inspired by the thousands of farmers, ranchers, entrepreneurs, activists, and policymakers across this nation who are meeting the many challenges related to nutrition, poverty, pollution, and climate. This podcast highlights the people and actions making our planet and communities healthier and more resilient. I hope to inspire listeners to use their food purchases and their votes, our democracy, to flip the table in support of a new and better food system for us all, to be part of the delicious revolution now underway. I'm a very practical person. I'm interested in seeing changes that will minimize future suffering and harm to people on the planet by dealing now with the mistakes we've made in the way we produce food. Given the history of political and corporate corruption or lying that we've seen over the years, I'm a bit skeptical about any claim made by a leader, company, or an industry. Proof is in the pudding, as they say. As we discussed in recent episodes, there's been a rebirth of an organization called the U.S. Farmers and Ranchers Alliance, with which I have engaged in live, nationally broadcast or taped and distributed dialogues involving agribusiness representatives, scientists, farmers, ranchers, and those like me calling for critical changes. I wanted to engage them back then in discussion to get to know the people. I had some good experiences in the 3 events I joined. I remember one in particular in Chicago. A thoughtful and demonstrably bright Midwestern farmer, who would not say it on camera, did admit to me during a break that he held a great anger at Monsanto. The infamous company was at the time a major sponsor of the dialogues. He resented that they had made it impossible to get the corn seed he wanted to plant to feed his hogs. Following that event, I concluded that the leadership of U.S. Farmers and Ranchers was seeking to change my mind in the dialogue, but did not appear to be open to change theirs. This was a problem for me. Unlike debates, which are a battle using arguments to win over supporters, dialogues are about deepening understanding by all involved. They're meant to allow an exchange of information to become more fully informed and thus more able to address a problem or challenge. After that last event in Chicago, I lost interest in the farmers and ranchers until recently. They put out a short and well-produced film called 30 Harvests. On their website, they say about this film, and I quote, "The next 30 years are the most important in the history of agriculture because we're about to fight climate change and create the food systems of the future." Well, I couldn't agree more. The film and its message caught my attention. It seemed to say the primary goal of farmers must change from feeding the world to combating the climate crisis underway. I discussed the film and the newly oriented alliance with many friends and colleagues. 2 of them told me about the alliance's new leader, Erin Fitzgerald. So I reached out and got a chance to meet with Erin on October 4th at Asilomar in Pacific Grove, California, which is the home of the famed annual Eco Farm Conference. Erin is impressive, clearly energetic, articulate, and intelligent. She is a generation younger than the previous alliance leader, and as a woman, somewhat unusual at the top of a commodity-oriented institution. She was attending the biannual gathering of Aspen Fellows, and you don't become an Aspen Fellow without demonstrating forward-looking leadership in your field. She is a graduate of Notre Dame, where she studied business and finance. She came out of the Innovation Center for U.S. Dairy, which is part of Dairy Management Incorporated, the industry promotion agency funded with dollars from the Dairy Checkoff program, which is how farmers impose a tax on themselves. While leading this innovation center, she moved her industry to focus on the climate challenge. She participated in the Obama administration's Climate Data Initiative and is a recipient of one of the Obama White House's Champion of Change Awards for her work on sustainable and climate-smart agriculture. Erin has an authentic history of working to move agriculture in new directions. I think you'll find the conversation quite interesting and perhaps hopeful. I find it hopeful. And I will be engaging Erin in the future because, as I said at the top of the show, the proof is in the pudding. I will be tasting the work of the U.S. Farmers and Ranchers Alliance going forward with the hope that the flavor proves as full as the promising look. So here we are at Asilomar, which is in Pacific Grove, California. We're sitting at the Asilomar facility where many amazing things have happened. I don't know if you're aware of this history. So the first real meeting of scientists who were doing genetic engineering occurred here.
Oh my goodness.
And the organic movement in many ways was born here. And this is where the annual Eco Farm Conference is, which is really the place where organic agriculture in California and people from all over the world come to discuss what's happening in organic agriculture. So we're in this really interesting place where worlds meet. Physicists have been here for big conferences. And we're here with Erin Fitzgerald. And Erin is the CEO of the U.S. Farmers and Ranchers Alliance, which we've talked about briefly or in little bits in 2 previous episodes. But we had the chance to meet with the new leader of this organization, which I think is an important organization. It's been controversial in my world, the sustainable agriculture world. But if you go to the U.S. Farmers and Ranchers website, which I've done a few times in recent weeks, you'll see some interesting things in language that might be of great interest to a lot of people. And I'm very hopeful of this. So Erin, nice to meet you here.
Nice to meet you. Thank you so much for that introduction on Asilomar. I had no idea.
Yeah. And so you've come all the way from the Midwest. You live in St. Louis, is that right? And you have a long history. And, people will know that by the time they hear us speaking now, because they'll hear it in the introduction. But you have a long history working with agriculture, all kinds of agriculture, and larger scale agriculture, what we would call industrial agriculture in my world. And you have a very interesting take. So why don't you just describe your philosophy that kind of drives and frames what you do, and then tell us what U.S. Farmers and Ranchers Alliance is.
Yeah, so I think my philosophy is that food and farming as a sector in general is an enabler to solve for climate change. We have both a footprint and a handprint that can contribute to society. And oftentimes, this sector is quite often mischaracterized. And then the second philosophy is that I believe that every farm uniquely through every acre underneath their stewardship can unlock the sustainable food systems of the future. So I don't really see conversations as either or. I see them as a co-creation or an and. And I think often we've created words that have created our worlds, and we tend to look at a fractured food and agriculture society, but really our entire sector is the sector. Brown and green things are the sector that can go solve for climate change, and also this enabling rural vibrancy in our communities, as well as this ability to be that handprint on nutrition and food security around the world. I often think sometimes we lose sight of why food and agriculture was set as goal number 2 in the Sustainable Development Goals. It's the only sector that can unlock all 17 goals. And I truly believe the next decade is our greatest challenge that we've ever been faced.
As humans?
As humans, yeah. And this sector needs to really step up together and lead from the front. We are the most amazing sector that can solve for all of these things. But quite often we get lost in our own infighting. And it's time that we step up and really focus on this big earth shot that we're all part of.
Wow, okay, great. So that's a great context about where you come from. So tell us about U.S. Farmers and Ranchers Alliance now.
Yeah, so it was really formed in 2010 when a bunch of farmers kind of came together and said, aren't we all the same thing? We're not one commodity. Many times you have the farmers on their own farmlands that are growing multiple things. And shouldn't we really work together? Over the last decade, I was at the dairy sector and really worked across the dairy industry, trying to get the dairy industry just to work together. Mm-hmm. There's so many different acronyms of different organizations, mm-hmm. and really said, how can we really take climate change and use it as an innovation mindset to not only draw down carbon, mitigate carbon, but also use it as a business model for innovation. It's not necessarily business or climate change, right? It's business and climate change. And when this job came open, I walked into the boardroom and I saw every farmer elected leader from each one of these different farm groups. And I thought, wow, this is a true mechanism of change. I had been in so many conversations where I always say it's 70 degrees and fluorescent in that boardroom, and we're making decisions on what a farmer should be doing on their farm. Mm. And, I saw these farmer leaders in the room, and I said, okay, this can be farmer-led and co-created with the food sector. I can't imagine a more powerful mechanism for change.
So, and just so people can understand that a little more deeply, it was because there was a diversity of different crops and types of agriculture in the room. Is that what it is? Yeah,
diversity of different crops, but also farmer leadership. For those that have ever worked with farmers, that they have this cooperative spirit, mm-hmm. and that the farmers, have an organization mechanism, and to meet another farmer who's been elected by his peers, and can work those farmer leadership groups and is willing to work with the brands on these topics, to me really seemed like, I guess, in these conversations around climate change and sustainable food, often people are talking past each other, and to really find farmers that are willing to work on these solutions with farmer leadership and invite the cross-sectoral interest into the conversation, to me is very powerful.
Good. So I think I mentioned this to you when we first spoke on the phone, but I participated in some of those early dialogues that in its first edition, I'll say, of U.S. Farmers and Ranchers, there was a set of dialogues they did around the country, and in those dialogues, two things I noticed that are different from what I'm seeing now in what I'll call version 2.0. In version 2.1, there were still people in those dialogues who were kind of arguing about the word of sustainability. But in the website now, that is up front, right up there, sustainability. Climate change is up front, right there. It wasn't really there. There was still kind of resistance to those ideas back then. That was 12 years ago, or somewhat, it was 2010, so was that 9 years ago? So I think that's a big change. And why? How has that come about? Why is it now? Why can you frame it in the way you framed it now without any problem?
This has been a topic front and center at every one of our board meetings. I quite often, even farmers will say, I'm not certain I understand the word sustainability, or I'm not certain I understand the word climate change. But then when we start talking about the attributes of these topics, there is a level of self-identification. So, this past year and really this past fall, we've seen two of the worst harvest seasons on record. We had an incredible flood, I call it sprinter, that did not go away. It was winter that moved into spring and even into
Were you in
August.
that? Did you see it?
In Missouri we did, and we just came out with a film called 30 Harvest.
Yes, which we've talked about before on the show.
Oh, great. Thank you. Uh-huh. And, I kind of say, well, it was a docudrama. It's very real. Mm-hmm. 2 weeks after filming, Megan Kaiser in the film was affected by a flood, and those rainwaters did not recede until August, so she didn't get in to plant anything this past year. Jay Hill, right after filming, was struck by 2 tornadoes that touched down on his farm. So, when we call it a 2.0 conversation, because the last decade, I think we were all talking about metrics and quantification and standards, and now we need to adapt the conversation to literally climate resiliency and adaptation. Mm-hmm. We've been modeling and measuring carbon, or this, some of my farmers call it this funny gas, that they want practical, tangible things that they can do, and we need to start talking about outcomes. So, how are we improving soil health as an outcome, not a practice? How are we improving carbon drawdown? How are we improving resiliency? And that affects both economic and social vibrancy. I got some updates today because it is harvest season. you always say you reap what you sow, right? This is the toughest emotional season right now for farmers that have gone through a lot of these major, not only economic disasters, but environmental disasters. So how are they going to handle mental awareness? So it's really thinking about all of these issues that are really kind of compounding right now, and being open to talk about it. It's more than just a dialogue. So, we can have the conversation, but what are we going to do about it?
Well, it's interesting. Yesterday I was in Sacramento, and I drove home last night, and I listened to a podcast, a BBC podcast called Food Chain, and they did a episode on farmer suicide, and they interviewed a woman from the Midwest who's been working with farmers, and the suicide rate is going up in the Midwest. It's up in Australia, it's up in New Zealand, it's up in the UK. India's had its history. So the pressures are immense for all the reasons that you described, and also cultural. Like, it's a lot of the men that farm don't want to talk about those things. They want to hold it together and be strong. And so there's major shifts going on, it seems to me, and all these crises, I'll call them, are forcing it. And it seems that's how history works, maybe. So this is exciting. You're talking about the fact that the conversation has shifted. Now you're focused on metrics. So the big question becomes, because as you described it, it is the, and I agree with you, it is the sector of all the sectors that touches so many things, because energy doesn't touch people's nutritional health in the same way. So how much of the industry do you need to actually have at the table to move the tanker on the ocean in the direction that you want to go? And how close to that are you?
I believe in multi-stakeholder models. We recently hosted an Honor the Harvest forum where we brought together 100 leaders from across the sector. Each seat in the room was hand-chosen to make certain that it represented every farmer group. And then ag suppliers, as well as cooperative brands, and then what we call enablers, NGOs, financial institutions, government, and storytellers. Artists, you could even say as well. Is 100 enough? Absolutely no way. We need to start creating these networks of change and leadership networks. And I think part of it is, you always hear me talk about, is the reason why I think this sector actually can make change faster than any other sector is because of people-based movements. We have a unique culture in food and farming, these centuries of, even if you meet restaurateurs or farmers themselves, of stewardship, these values and a commitment to leave the land better for the next generation. Now, in sustainability circles, and I'm at a conference right now with other sustainability leaders, we tend to, as business professionals, we'll set goals and targets and metrics. I'm like, well, that's really great. We have these sustainable development goals, but how do you enable the people-based change to go after those goals? And stewardship, sustainability is putting your values to work. And translating our innate culture as a food and agricultural sector, and making the values work day in and day out, getting the economics, no matter how tough the economics are. And in this last economy, I would say, is really hard for farmers, but making it work, lining up the economics and the constructs of our community and the finite resources of our planet. That's what sustainability is. You always hear me refer to stewardship and sustainability. Our sector has stewardship, and that's like, if you look at other sectors, they're trying to go back and create purpose-driven business models, right? Well, we already have that. So I think it's a hidden asset that if we can create these mobilized networks of people and leaders, that we can begin to address this decade.
The time we have. So you said something really key there, because the thing I noticed in 30 Harvests, which is a powerful short film, which is about a young farming family dealing with the economic struggles and then making a decision to go back in it, not just for the economics, but to become part of the solution to the climate challenge. That was a huge, to me, symbolic change from the past, because, as you just said, the businesses have been purpose-driven, but until now, in my mind, it's always been about we feed the world. What you've seemed to be doing, which I hope you're doing, is broadening that to, yes, we're feeding people, but more than that. And the stewardship piece has raised up, because the basic complaint from the world that I come from about agriculture today is that it's put profit before people and planet. And so What I want to know is, do you believe you can get those things in balance so that people and planet are getting as much back from the system as we're taking?
It's so interesting because, this just shows the power of storytelling. This video, we really spent a lot of time on to make certain that it would resonate with every single audience. When I hear from farmers, they're really struggling, and they have been struggling. And so they say, I'm doing all of these great things, but I can do more. But how can I do more? It's these trade-offs, right, that are constantly there. Mm-hmm. And then we see societies really saying, like, I love all this green space. I love all these flyways. I need you to do more. And in that construct is really what we call ecosystem service markets. Mm-hmm. And we have got to make certain that we start lining up those shared values and societal values. Because currently, right now, I'll hear some of my farmers saying, well, he went back to the farm, but who came in and helped fix that business model? Mm-hmm. And then you hear the consumer and the person's looking for this ecosystem service saying, oh, thank goodness he came back. But in that story, the missing part of the story is how did we collectively make that business model work for the future for that family? That's
great because it reminds me of one of the earlier podcasts we did with Dan Emhoff, who's written a book called Food. It's about the Farm Bill. The third edition's out. It was originally called Food Fight. Now it's called the Farm Bill, a citizen's guide to help people understand what's in the Farm Bill. And one of the conversations that we had is, what do we subsidize? What are we subsidizing? I personally believe that agriculture, in order to make food affordable, we need to subsidize agriculture. But the question is, what are we subsidizing for? So right now we're subsidizing really, the biggest thing is insurance. So I'm wondering if you're thinking about how you would reshape the subsidy system to actually pay for ecosystem services in a larger way. We're doing experiments now. The rice growers have done incredible work in California with bringing back flyways. And now they're working on bringing back the salmon because they have the hatcheries where really small, where the base of the system exists. So I'm very curious about, if you look 10 years out, because that's what we're talking about, right? Well, we're talking about 30 harvests, but 10 years are key. Mm-hmm. Talk to me about what you imagine the system would look like at the federal level in 10 years.
So I do not get involved in federal policy. So that actually gives me some freedom, though, to imagine other mechanisms.
Sorry about the jet, but we're outside. Okay. Beautiful day here.
It's beautiful here. Yeah. If you look at how big the food sector is, and 48% of the land mass is in the stewardship of farmers. I think about creative ways beyond just policy that we might enable the food system. So I think one is ecosystem service credits, so the ability to trade both carbon and or nitrogen or phosphorus in local watersheds. I think that there are also creative financial mechanisms that might be enabled. For example, green bonds or blue bonds.
Green bonds
could be a really
Howard Shapiro's.
Yeah, I really do believe it's a very creative way to begin to look at investment, because essentially, that is what many of these farmers are doing. You could look at even the ability to do insetting. I know many of my farmers are growing these huge, amazing monarch just for their grandchildren, to be honest. But that actually could be.
You mean monarch refuges, butterfly refuges?
Yeah, and so there could be ways that we, as societies, pay for that.
But see, that would be policy.
Actually, you can do it. You can do it through apps. You could do it through any type of system.
So you're saying citizens would step up?
As a child, I used to buy a whale. I used to buy a star, and maybe that's how I'm in the business I'm in now. Yeah. But I think there are very creative ways that we can begin to do some of this. I talked to a lot of brands, and I said, not only can you have your supply chain sourcing policy, but maybe think about, gosh, if I just bought renewable energy from farmers, then I'm creating a virtuous beneficial ecosystem in that farming community. So there's a bunch of ways that we can stack benefits to get the results that we want. I don't think it's just policy. I think there's a lot of ways. We actually just got a grant to begin to start looking at all these different financial mechanisms that could be maybe unlocked.
Okay, that's good. So if you, I just want to dig down. So the policy question becomes problematic because why?
I think when I always think about policy, it's always debating the here and now. as opposed to business models for the future. I mean, I'm definitely in the business models space. You can maybe think of us as a think and do tank. That frees up more of a conversation for facilitated dialogue. It doesn't create these
it's not so
camps.
Polarized.
Right, it doesn't create camps. And, if we can bring science and information to bear that helps inform different tribes that are having conversations, great. But we're moving forward on basically what we can do now. I also am not focused on 2 or 4 year cycles. I'm focused on the next decade. So that's also freeing in many of the conversations.
I agree. It's much better be looking like that. So it's interesting. I was just to share. Yesterday, I was at a very interesting meeting with what you would call environmental justice advocates. It was an all-day session, and we were talking about how to create more equity for folks who, in rural communities primarily, who have suffered the most from the degradation of rural communities because of the concentration, because of all things that have happened in rural communities, and with agriculture, really, the loss of jobs comes down to. And also the squeeze on farmers, which disallows them, it makes it very tough for them to invest in communities because they're just trying to make their operations work. So there's less money flowing into communities. So, and I was struck by how many people were railing against capitalism. The capitalism is the problem. The capitalism will always end up exploiting people or the land. Now, I actually believe that capitalism is an extension of how we believe and what we think, and that if you think and believe differently, you could actually change capitalism. Maybe I'm naive, but I believe that, but it requires the human condition change, that we change as individuals to get to a different value set or a more balanced value set. So the reason I'm bringing this up is because what a lot of people from my world would look at what you said and say, oh, it's business is the solution. Therefore, in the end, we're not going to change the level of equity. We're not going to. There's going to be always a really thin band of really wealthy people, and there'll be a small band of middle people, and there'll be a lot of poor people. So, how do you deal with that? How would you face that, or does that even enter your mind that you have to think about that kind of thing?
I mean, it's what I think about every day. So I'm part of this fellowship of business as an agent for social good. I think you just saw for the first time ever on August 19th, the Business Roundtable change their mindset that the shareholder value, your primary purpose of business is to the shareholder. They actually said the primary purpose of business is to the stakeholder.
Great.
And, I think that when we look particularly at farming, and that's, you hear many of our farmers, they say, like, I'm doing all of this, but I'm not being valued for what I'm doing. And I know I can do more, but it's not valued. And so values, actually, the ability to appreciate and bring up in value comes not only monetarily, it also comes in terms of like the visibility or the unrecognized servant, right? So many times you'll hear farmers say, well, no one just cares about my profession. And so that's not even a financial value, that's also a societal value. And so trying to get both those things to line up, in my mind, is really what we're trying to do. It's not just value financially, but it's actually appreciating and bringing up in value the potential that lies within the food and agriculture sector.
Okay, so I'm really enjoying this because there's a lot of things are coming up for me, what you're saying. You just said, what entered my mind as you said that is the very interesting balance between when business is the innovator and when government is the innovator. Business is the innovator often and has been for decades. Government becomes an innovator in great moments of tragedy or crisis. The Great Depression, when the Farm Bill was born. That was a moment when government actually was in the innovative space. So as you were talking, I was thinking, well, maybe what's happening now, and it's been happening for a while in different forms, it's catching on. It seems like your work and what you're doing now is a sign that it's accelerating. That business is innovating, and they're going to become the primer of the pump that's needed to show government where to go. What do you think about that?
You don't think I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I wish I could predict. I mean, I think what you're asking though is like, how quickly can we change? If you think about the next decade, and you do believe in climate change, you do believe in, protecting green spaces and the ability to draw down, when I look at the trajectory of, let's just say, the energy sector, and what I would call gray or black carbon sector, I think we need a disruptor, and that is the food and ag space. There is no other sector that can accelerate climate mitigation and get us to a net zero pathway than agriculture. And so I'm kind of saying, like, this is the sector, if you had to bet on, both people-based and I guess from a financial perspective and maybe a policy perspective, this is the sector that can make change quickly.
And that's because what you're saying is that there are two sides to that, right? There's as you said, there's mitigation and there's adaptation, and the mitigation piece is about capturing carbon in the soil. So are you saying that the intensification of no-till or low-till, the use of compost or whatever forms to actually increase carbon is one main strategy? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, so I think you have, in terms of mitigation, so as our soil improves, every single acre improves just by one act, right? Around the world, we need 0.4% change. That's not a lot. So it's a lot of thousands of little things that can add up that our farmers are doing. And so for me, it's not looking at within our own sector, like picking different types. It's saying we want 1,000 regenerative acts. Every farmer can do a little bit. And I see them on this journey of continuous improvement. And if that's true, then we can enable the rest of the black carbon sectors, energy, transport, and houses, to enable in the next 10 years a net zero economy. There is no way right now, in given the current trajectory of change, that those sectors are going to really meet their goals. So if you think about carbon as a portfolio or carbon adaptation as a portfolio, we have got to have the food and ag sector in this conversation.
So does that mean that we be using less fossil fuels as the energy behind the way we farm?
Well, the way to think about it, I think that our sector actually can displace many of the black carbon.
So you're saying basically corn-based fuels? Is that what you're talking about?
Any bio-based, anything.
Any bio-based fuels.
So any green thing, right? Even all the different fibers and, like plastic straws. We might be seeing like corn or soy-based straws or all sorts of inks. We want everything to become, why wouldn't we
biological?
Why wouldn't we want everything happening from the surface of the earth rather than the center of the earth? The Amazon rainforest was, I think, really got everyone's attention because they saw brown.
Last summer, you mean?
Yeah, they saw
fires.
Brown and green things being destroyed, right? And they said, that's the lungs of our planet. I'm like, you do realize that every time you turn on your car, those fossil fuels are forest upon forest upon forest from centuries.
Right.
We don't have
Eons
that same.
ago.
Yeah,
right.
We don't have that same level of consciousness that like these brown and green things. If we just enable a brown and green economy, and maybe I'll add blue, right? Blue was good too. That will offset the fossil fuel based sector.
Wow. So has the science been done on that to show that that's actually accurate? You could do that. You could supplant.
So if you look at
so just so people understand, what you're saying is that that we would stop basically using coal and other forms of fossil fuel and replace it with fuels that were coming from farmlands.
Not just fuels, but everything.
Yeah. So the clothes we're wearing.
Right. So here you have a cotton, right? Cotton was also the seed was then fed back to an animal. So you're upcycling many
Which
different
is done
times.
now, right?
Right. So that's like what you want to see is more of this biogenic cycle or food cycle, virtuous food cycle.
And the belief is that you could. The hope is, and the intention is, to reveal how we could supplant the need for all these other black carbon fuels and fibers through the agricultural sector. Is there enough land?
Well, so yeah, you have to be able to do more with. You can't. We want to make certain that we're freezing the footprint of agriculture, right? So the current lands that are in productive use, we want to make sure that every single bit is harvested to its highest potential. We also need to make certain we're closing the loop, right? We currently, I always say, we don't honor the harvest, right? We as consumers have a key component in that where we are losing 30 to 40%.
Food waste.
We just throw it in a magical place called away. Where's away, right?
Right.
And it can have fiber benefits, that nitrogen, that phosphorus, all those things can be used. back into that food cycle.
Carbon too. I mean,
absolutely.
You can. Yeah, I mean, compost. Or
digesters and create biomethane gas. Right.
San Francisco, has a great program, and the vineyards and the farms all around San Francisco Bay Area are buying that compost that comes out of San Francisco. I want to get back to this other big portion of the challenge, for your challenge, which is to bring more and more of the agricultural sector into the conversation and into the mission that you've created. You've just stated what it is, to create a biogenic economy, basically, that rests at its base on agriculture. That's really what I'm hearing from you. That agriculture has become I've always called it we're in the biological age now. We're not in the industrial age, and we're passing the technology age. We're really in the biological age if we're going to make it through this century. So if that's what you're in agreement with, is when you say the next 10 years, is the goal to bring all of agriculture, or 90%, I don't know what the number is, right? But it has to be some number that gets you into, what's the word? It becomes self-fulfilling and it's unstoppable. Do you have a number in mind of how much agriculture you got to bring in? Or
I don't have a number. I mean, I just believe that this is the sector that is the sector to invest in. This is the sector where the greatest jobs are going to be made. This is a sector where I see farming powering that future. And I feel that farming is the oldest profession, yet it's the least understood, and it is the sector that's going to enable the next decade. I mean, if I were graduating college right now, I guess I graduated and they said, "Oh, you're going to have a job in technology," and everyone's like, "What's technology?" And people always ask me, "Well, what's sustainability?" I'm like, "It's agriculture, right? This is the sector where you are going to see incredible opportunities. And I believe that will translate back to the farm. I believe that that's going to enable and mobilize people beyond that we can't even imagine now.
Well, that's a key challenge for you then, because right now the farm gets 14 or less cents of every dollar in the food system. So that's going to have to change to get to what you're talking about. So the bringing in the brands and the industrial side, the manufacturers of food, seems critical. What kind of response are you getting there?
You're not going to believe it. It's worse than that. It's 7 cents.
7 cents, okay.
That's shocking, right?
Yeah, right.
And so, if you look at that business model, not only, I always say, imagine a chef, right? We know chef. When I walk into a corner market and they make a muffin, right? They price and get the eggs and the flour and they cook it for 350 degrees and they get the water. Imagine making muffins in agriculture. That means maybe I can't get enough water. Maybe I won't be able to cook it a whole hour at 350. Oh, and by the way, the time I trained my employees and sold that muffin, the price has changed. This is the most complex business model.
Very, very complex.
And it's not exactly, we have to make certain that while it's 7 cents, it's the lowest, right? In the time that they've been tracking it. But are there other things that we can start valuing that farm and that farm community is providing? That's why I think we need to look at all these different attributes that are happening on this farm. And you'll hear farmers say, I just want you to, I can do more and I'm willing to do more, but you have to pay me because this 7 cents is not working.
Right. And
you can see that across the country. And I think that's where we start valuing these other services that they are providing. Quite often I see, if you look at upstate New York, many of these farmers are the water filter to New York City, but they're not valued.
The Catskill Watershed Project years ago, although that's a very good example of what you maybe were talking about earlier, because I actually did a little bit of work for them in the early 2000s when they were going back there. The city of New York was looking at the specter of spending $1 billion for a filtration plant, and what they realized is they could spend a couple of $100 million and refurbish all the dairy farms.
Yep.
And what they did is just so our audience knows, they set them up to keep the water clean. They recapitalized them. They built new sheds. They got new equipment. They had monitoring equipment they gave them, and the city saved a ton of money, and it revitalized the dairy industry. We did something similar in Sonoma County. We created an open space district, and we paid farmers for their development rights. And the dairy farms in Sonoma County capitalized, and many of them went organic because they could afford to do it. They could take that during the transition phase. There were a lot of things that happened as a result of the community. But I will say that was, in both cases, it was local policy, not federal, not state. It was localized. which I believe is much easier to do anyway. That's why we work at the state level mostly. But so I think there are examples of what you're talking about doing, and I agree. But I'm still hopeful. I'm still wondering, like, the ability, because it's not just the farmer that's getting 7%. In the food and ag space, it's the lowest paid sector of the economy. 22% of the nation's workers are in the food system, and they're the lowest paid.
Yep.
I mean, talk to the chef, right? San Francisco, we just did a podcast a while back on it's impossible to hire chefs and staff because no one can live there because they can't afford to, because the salaries are so low. So there's a whole huge economic shift. And so you're going to need, this is what Dan Imhoff, if he was here, he would say, the farmers need to take back the system. Because it's been set up basically by those who are processing food and policymakers. Do you see that happening? Is that what you're seeing from your people? They're going to take back the system?
I don't know. I mean, again, coming back to a policy system, but I think we need to figure out new business models. So in the example that you mentioned about upstate New York, here you looked at the ability for this urban-rural intersect, right? So a pound of nitrogen processed by the city is $90, but for a farmer to do it's $8. So therein lies a market incentive. And we also, in those types of examples, then you are able to look at new types of technology, right, that can process nitrogen on a farm by fractionating manure, for example, and things. So I think we need, that's tech, that's innovation, that's, I would say even we know more about the surface of the moon than we do our soils. There's so much potential. So I think, I don't know if it's so much policy as a need to call on all innovators. That's a big key component to what we're doing, is calling on the scientists and different types of innovators from other sectors. How can we look at the digitization of agriculture? How can we, look at different financial mechanisms? We know that this can be done, but agriculture as a sector has never really called and invited other people to the table to say, let's work on this grand challenge together. So I think it's so much more than just policy. It's really looking at, again, technology, science, innovation, and finance. And you, based on what you're saying, you have a lot of faith in the way that Howard Shapiro has a lot of faith in business leaders to make decisions that create a more equitable society. You believe that is possible, and the evidence you gave is this new decision by the Business Roundtable to basically say the primary goal is not to increase shareholder value; it's to increase stakeholder value, which broadens the base. That's what you would stand on as the indicator of where things are headed. Yeah, and I think we have with new corporate social responsibility metrics, we have ways now of measuring and starting to monetize the multivariate beyond just a shareholder, right? We're looking for carbon outcomes. We're looking for that organization to be resilient in the next decade. How are they managing risk in their organization if it's a water-based institution? I think one of the things we need to figure out is for the small businesses like our farmers, how are we helping them in looking at those levels of risk in the future? Because many of our farmers are taking on a lot of risk. You look at if you do look into, the flooding zones and you look at the episodic rains, we look at
the heat, the fires where I live, Sonoma County nearly burnt up.
So again, it comes back to we can't just focus the conversation on measurement. What are the new adaptive models for these farmers? How will supply chains, are they going to just switch farmers when, the times get bad? What does a forward contract look like? But you could track carbon and just say, I'm looking at that carbon performance of that farm over time. Well, they could have one bad year and it would wipe everything out. So how we need to really start thinking about these new business models, and I'm not certain I have the answer for that.
No, that's going to take some time to figure out, and that's why you're bringing the brain trust together,
exactly.
Right? Because you need a lot of brains on something like that's complex. So I have one final question. As I've said a few times, and I think in previous conversation and today, there is a lot of skepticism among mostly the environmental and social justice community who have battled over the last 50 years with agriculture, 40 years anyway, over the challenges, I would call them unintended consequences. I mean, farmers want to profit, so farm workers had a hard time. Farmers want to profit, and they use certain tools that we're causing harm. That's changing, particularly in California. I don't know about the rest of the country because I don't track it as closely, but it's changing. So what would you say, or does it even matter to you, what these other stakeholders think of what you're doing? What would you say to them to open their minds or be willing to engage or give you the benefit of the doubt for a period? I mean, what would you say to them?
I mean, I would say that we probably are in this together. Our mission is to co-create the sustainable food systems of the future, and co-create is a big key component of that. I think we have been talking past each other. If I hear actually both of those conversations that you just framed, to me, that's an innovative business model. So it's like looking for the and saying, okay, well, how do we get then, if we're going to actually move the needle, then what would that look like? Mm-hmm. And so I love that, let's have the conversation, but more importantly, let's find the and let's get to work. I don't think we have time. Quite
to
frankly.
Keep throwing stones, right?
Absolutely.
Right.
This is a business model. We can innovate.
Right.
What would it look like?
Yes. Okay, well, good. Well, I'm going to make an invitation. I want to have I'd like to do another one of these in maybe early next year, where we bring maybe someone from the EJ community and someone from the environmental community, and we have a similar conversation. And maybe we all bring a question, and it's we do a kind of an appreciative inquiry approach, not attacking each other, but do appreciative inquiry.
I would love that.
Okay.
I would love that. The strengths of the system are more powerful than we realize.
Right. Good. Well, thank you for your time. Enjoy your weekend here. You're a fellow of what just went on.
Aspen Institute.
Aspen Institute fellow here, and you're with your fellows from many classes here having a retreat. What a fantastic place to do it. Enjoy your weekend.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
You have been listening to Flipping the Table, a podcast about food, farming, and the future. Flipping the Table is hosted by me, Michael Reed Dimmock, and produced by Patrick Sexton. Our production colleague is Doris Meyer. Our sponsors include Roots of Change and the Public Health Institute. If you have questions, comments, suggestions, or would like to sponsor Flipping the Table, please email us at comments@fthetable.com. That's comments@fthetable.com. Thank you for listening.